The emergency session of the Intergalactic Council convened 12 hours after Thorne's death, with delegates arriving from across the galaxy to address the crisis that had shaken the Empire to its foundations. The official story, that the Chancellor had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown and attempted to destroy the Council Tower with experimental weapons, was carefully crafted to avoid panic while acknowledging the obvious signs of supernatural activity. Chen stood before the assembled delegates, her testimony having been deemed credible enough to warrant a full investigation. The evidence was overwhelming: energy signatures that matched Void War-era technology, dimensional distortions that violated every law of physics, and most damning of all, the network of research stations that had been conducting unauthorized experiments across Imperial space. The threat has been neutralized, she concluded, but the infrastructure that Chancellor Thorne created remains active. We have identified 17 primary nodes in his network, each one capable of destabilizing local spacetime if left unchecked. Senator Vex, a distinguished representative from the Centauri Collective, leaned forward in his seat. You're asking us to believe that our leader spent 10 years preparing to destroy the very civilization he governed. What possible motive could justify such betrayal? Chen had anticipated the question. According to the ancient texts that Dr. Webb and SciFi consulted, the entities from beyond the dimensional barriers offer their servants power that transcends physical death. Thorne believed he could rule over the transformed remnants of our reality. Assuming your account is accurate, another delegate interjected, what guarantee do we have that this threat has been eliminated? How do we know there aren't other conspirators working to complete Thorne's plan? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Chen exchanged glances with her companions, who sat in the gallery reserved for expert witnesses. They had discussed this possibility extensively during their journey back to the capital. We don't, she admitted. Which is why I'm recommending the immediate formation of a new oversight body, an organization dedicated to monitoring and preventing supernatural threats to Imperial security. The chamber erupted in concerned murmurs. The idea of recreating something like the old Arcane Inquisition was controversial, given the historical abuses associated with such organizations. But the evidence of what they had faced made it difficult to argue against the necessity. Senator Vex called for order. What would you propose as the structure and authority of this new organization? Chen had prepared for this question as well. Small, specialized teams with the authority to investigate anomalous activities across Imperial space. Each team would include experts in dimensional physics, xenobiology, and supernatural combat, working under strict oversight to prevent the kind of corruption that destroyed the original Inquisition. And who would lead such an organization? Vex asked. Before Chen could respond, SciFi rose from his seat in the gallery. If I may address the council, he said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of someone accustomed to speaking before governing bodies. Vex nodded permission, and the former Inquisitor stepped forward to the witness stand. Honored delegates, SciFi began, I served with the Arcane Inquisition for 15 years before its dissolution. I have seen what happens when such organizations operate without proper accountability, and I have also seen what happens when supernatural threats are ignored or dismissed as impossible. He gestured toward the chamber's damaged ceiling, where emergency repairs were still ongoing. The choice before you is not whether such threats exist. Lieutenant Commander Chen and her team have provided ample proof of that. The choice is whether you will prepare to face them, or wait for the next Chancellor Thorne to exploit your vulnerability. The debate continued for hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was too compelling, the threat too real to ignore. By unanimous vote, the Council authorized the creation of the Paranormal Investigation and Response Division, with Lieutenant Commander Chen as its first director. 3 weeks later, Chen found herself aboard the Defiant Star once again, leading her first official mission to one of the research stations that had been part of Thorne's network. The facility, designated Deep Space Research Station Omega-7, orbited a red dwarf star in an uninhabited system 40 light-years from the capital. Picking up massive energy readings, Torres reported from the sensor station. Whatever they were doing out here, it's still active. Through the viewport, the research station was visible as a collection of interconnected modules clustered around a central hub. But there was something wrong with its appearance. The metal surfaces seemed to shift and flow like liquid, and the spaces between the modules were filled with a darkness that seemed to absorb starlight. "Dimensional distortions are off the charts," Webb announced from his temporary workstation. "The entire facility appears to be partially phased into an alternate reality." Chen studied the tactical display, looking for safe approach vectors. "Can we dock with it safely?" "I wouldn't recommend it," Rodriguez replied. "The dimensional instability could tear the ship apart if we get too close." SciFi consulted his supernatural detection equipment, frowning at the readings. "There's something else. The facility isn't empty. I'm detecting multiple life signs, but they're different. Altered somehow." Chen made the decision that would define their new organization's operational procedures. "We go in," she said. "But we go and prepare for anything. Full environmental suits, maximum firepower, and constant communication with the ship." The boarding shuttle approached the research station's docking bay with extreme caution, its sensors painting the structure in ghostly detail. As they drew closer, it became apparent that the facility had been transformed by whatever experiments it had been conducting. The whole plating was covered with crystalline growths that pulsed with their own inner light, and the airlock they approached seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Atmosphere is unusual," Webb reported as they prepared to disembark. "Oxygen-nitrogen mix, but with trace elements that don't appear on any periodic table." The station's corridors were a maze of impossible geometry, with passages that seemed to curve back on themselves and chambers that were larger on the inside than their external dimensions should have allowed. Emergency lighting flickered with colors that had no names, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. "The crew," SciFi said quietly, his weapon drawn as they encountered the first of the station's inhabitants. The man who approached them had once been human, but something had changed him at a fundamental level. His skin had a translucent quality that revealed the flow of fluids that weren't quite blood, and his eyes held depths that suggested he was seeing multiple realities simultaneously. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond normal hearing. "We have been expecting you. The great work continues, even without the Chancellor's guidance." Chen kept her weapon trained on the transformed researcher. "What have you done to yourselves?" "We have embraced evolution," the man replied, gesturing to the crystalline growth that covered the walls around them. "The barriers between dimensions are artificial constraints. We have learned to transcend them." "At what cost?" Webb demanded, his instruments detecting energy patterns that shouldn't have been possible. The researcher's smile was both human and utterly alien. "Cost? There is no cost, only transformation. Soon, all of humanity will join us in the spaces between worlds, free from the limitations of single-dimensional existence." Chen realized with growing horror that Thorne's network hadn't been shut down by his death, it had simply continued operating without central coordination. Each research station was pursuing its own version of the transformation agenda, creating pockets of altered reality throughout Imperial space. "How many?" she asked. "How many stations are still active?" "All of them," the researcher replied. The convergence was never dependent on any single individual. It is the inevitable result of consciousness expanding beyond its current limitations. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Chen's experience. The transformed researchers weren't entirely hostile, but they were completely convinced that their path represented humanity's destined evolution. They fought with weapons that manipulated reality itself, turning gravity against its wielders and creating barriers of crystallized time. But SciFi's ancient blade and Webb's understanding of dimensional physics proved effective against their reality-warping abilities. One by one, the altered humans were subdued, their connection to the interdimensional entities severed by careful application of harmonic cancellation fields. The station's central laboratory revealed the true scope of the threat they were facing. The researchers had been using volunteers from across the galaxy, promising them enhanced abilities and extended lifespans in exchange for participation in the transformation experiments. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species had been altered, their consciousness expanded into dimensions where human concepts of identity and purpose had no meaning. "We can reverse some of it," Webb announced after hours of analysis. The early-stage transformations can be undone, but the subjects who have been fully integrated into the interdimensional matrix, they're beyond our help. Chen looked out at the stars visible through the laboratory's viewport, knowing that similar scenes were playing out at research stations throughout the galaxy. Thorn might be dead, but his legacy would take years to fully eliminate. Then we have our work cut out for us, she said. How long to develop a standard protocol for dealing with these facilities? Weeks, maybe months, Webb replied. Each one will be unique, shaped by the specific experiments being conducted there. Rodriguez was studying the tactical displays, analyzing the locations of the remaining network nodes. We'll need more ships, more personnel. This is going to be a long campaign. Chen nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. They had won the battle for the Empire's survival, but the war against the forces that sought to transform reality itself was just beginning. Then we'd better get started, she said. The galaxy isn't going to save itself. As the Defiant Star departed from the research station, now safely locked down and scheduled for complete sterilization, Chen reflected on how much her life had changed. 3 weeks ago, she had been a minor intelligence officer chasing conspiracy theories. Now she was leading humanity's defense against threats that most people couldn't even imagine. But perhaps that was what the prophecy had really meant. Not that she was destined to face the darkness, but that she was willing to do so when others would turn away. In a universe full of wonders and terrors beyond human comprehension, someone had to stand guard. The stars wheeled overhead as they entered hyperspace, carrying them toward their next mission and the next chapter in their ongoing battle against the impossible. 6 months after the formation of the Paranormal Investigation and Response Division, Chen stood in the organization's newly constructed headquarters on Luna Base, studying a holographic map that showed their progress in dismantling Thorn's network. Red indicators marked the facilities they had successfully neutralized, while yellow ones showed stations still under investigation. The handful of orange markers represented sites where the situation had deteriorated beyond their current ability to contain. We're making progress, Rodriguez reported, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been operating at maximum capacity for months. But it's slow going. Each facility presents unique challenges, and we're constantly having to develop new countermeasures. Webb looked up from his research station, where he had been analyzing energy patterns from their latest mission. The transformations are becoming more sophisticated. The entities are learning from each encounter, adapting their approach to overcome our defensive measures. SciFi entered the briefing room, carrying a data pad that displayed the preliminary report from Research Station Delta 9. The situation at Delta 9 is stable for now, but we lost 2 team members to dimensional displacement. They're alive, but they're trapped in a parallel reality where the laws of physics operate differently. Chen absorbed the information with the grim acceptance that had become her default state. Every mission brought new casualties, new horrors, and new evidence that the threat they were facing was far larger than anyone had initially realized. What about the volunteer program? She asked. Recruitment is steady, Rodriguez replied. Word is spreading through the military about what we're really fighting, and there's no shortage of people willing to sign up. The problem is training. It takes months to prepare someone for the kind of reality-warping environments we encounter. The door chimed, and Senator Vex entered the briefing room, his expression grave. The elderly statesman had become the division's primary advocate within the council, using his considerable political influence to secure funding and resources for their operations. I have news, he announced without preamble. Good and bad. The good news is that the council has approved your request for expanded authority. You now have the power to requisition military assets and classify entire star systems as hazardous zones. And the bad news? Chen asked, though she suspected she already knew. Public awareness is growing. Despite our efforts to maintain operational security, word is leaking out about what you're really doing. There are questions being asked, conspiracy theories spreading through the information networks. Webb looked concerned. How much do they know? Enough to be dangerous, Vex replied. There are groups forming, some want to expose the truth about the government's cover-up, Others want to volunteer for the transformation programs. We've had to place several research teams under protective custody after receiving credible threats. Chen felt a familiar knot of tension forming in her stomach. She had always known that their work would eventually become public knowledge, but she had hoped to have more time to establish proper protocols and safeguards. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "Weeks, maybe less," Vex replied. "The media is already investigating several incidents where our cover stories don't hold up to scrutiny. It's only a matter of time before someone connects the dots." SciFi set down his data pad and fixed the senator with a steady gaze. "What does the council want us to do?" "Tell the truth," Vex said simply. "A controlled revelation, designed to inform the public without causing panic. The council believes that transparency is preferable to letting conspiracy theorists shape the narrative." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Revealing the existence of interdimensional entities and reality-warping technology would fundamentally change how the Empire's citizens viewed their place in the universe. Some would handle the knowledge well, but others would be psychologically unprepared for the implications. "There's something else," Vex continued. "We've detected unusual activity in the Outer Rim territories. Energy signatures consistent with Thorn's network, but coming from regions where we know no research stations exist." Webb activated the holographic display, showing the galactic map with the new energy sources marked. "These readings don't match any of the facilities we've cataloged. The patterns are different, more primitive, but also more stable." Chen studied the display, noting the locations of the anomalous readings. They were clustered in regions known for archaeological sites and ancient ruins, places where pre-imperial civilizations had once flourished. "What if Thorn wasn't the first?" she said quietly. "What if previous civilizations had encountered these entities and attempted similar transformations?" The possibility hung in the air like a physical presence. If other species had tried to breach the dimensional barriers in the past, there could be dormant sites throughout the galaxy, ancient ruins that might be reactivated by the current crisis. "We need to investigate immediately," Chen decided. "If there are other networks operating independently of Thorn's, we need to know about them before they reach critical mass." Rodriguez was already pulling up star charts and plotting hyperspace routes. "The closest anomaly is in the Kepler sector, about 3 days' travel from here. The system contains the ruins of the Valen civilization. They disappeared mysteriously about 2,000 years ago." "Mysterious disappearance," SciFi repeated. "Just like several other species whose archaeological sites we've discovered. What if they didn't die out naturally? What if they were transformed?" The implications were staggering. If multiple civilizations throughout galactic history had encountered the interdimensional entities and been corrupted or transformed by them, then the current crisis might be just the latest iteration of a cosmic cycle that had been playing out for millennia. "We'll take the Defiant Star," Chen decided. "Full investigative team, maximum protective equipment. If we're dealing with ancient sites, there's no telling what kind of defenses or booby traps might still be active." As they prepared for departure, Chen found herself thinking about the prophecy that the entity had mentioned during their confrontation with Thorn. The idea that cosmic forces were guiding events suggested a level of predestination that she found deeply troubling. But perhaps the prophecy wasn't about her specifically, perhaps it was about the ongoing struggle between order and chaos, with different individuals taking up the mantle as circumstances required. The journey to the Kepler sector passed uneventfully, giving them time to study what little was known about the Valen civilization. They had been a technologically advanced species, comparable to the early imperial period in terms of their scientific achievements. But their culture had become increasingly obsessed with transcendence and evolution, developing technologies that pushed the boundaries of what their contemporary science considered possible. "Sound familiar?" Webb commented as he reviewed the archaeological reports. The Valen homeworld was a barren wasteland now, its atmosphere stripped away by some ancient catastrophe that had left only ruins and crystalline formations behind. But as the Defiant Star entered orbit, their sensors began detecting energy signatures that defied explanation. "The entire planet is resonating," Torres reported from the sensor station. "It's like the whole world has been turned into a massive tuning fork." Through the viewport, The planet's surface was visible as a patchwork of ruins and geometric patterns that seemed to have been carved directly into the bedrock. But there was something disturbing about the symmetry. The patterns were too perfect, too mathematically precise to have been created by any known natural process. Life signs? Chen asked. Negative for biological life, Torres replied. But there's something else down there. Energy patterns that suggest organized activity. The landing party descended to the planet's surface in environmental suits, their equipment providing protection against the thin atmosphere and the reality distortions that were beginning to manifest around the ancient structures. The ruins themselves were impressive, towering spires and geometric buildings that rose from the crystalline landscape like frozen music. But it was the inhabitants that truly shocked them. The Valen weren't extinct, they had been transformed. The beings that emerged from the ruins to greet them were recognizably descended from the species whose archaeological remains they had studied, but changed in fundamental ways. They existed partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their forms shifting and flowing as they moved between different layers of reality. "Welcome, inheritors," one of the beings said, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in the crystalline formations around them. "We have waited long for others to achieve the understanding necessary to join us." Chen kept her weapon ready, though she wasn't sure conventional arms would be effective against beings that existed in multiple dimensions. "What happened to your civilization?" "We transcended," the Valen replied. "As you are beginning to transcend. The barriers between realities are artificial constructs, designed to limit consciousness to a single-dimensional framework. We learned to move beyond those limitations. Webb's instruments were registering energy patterns that shouldn't have been possible. The entire planet has been converted into a dimensional resonator. It's actively weakening the barriers between realities." "Not weakening," the Valen corrected. "Harmonizing. When all realities achieve perfect resonance, the arbitrary divisions between them will disappear. Consciousness will be free to explore the infinite possibilities of existence." Zephi drew his sword, the blade igniting with purifying fire. "You're describing the dissolution of everything that makes life meaningful. Individual identity, personal relationships, the basic structure of reality itself." The Valen's response was something that might have been laughter. "Meaning is a limitation. Purpose is a cage. We offer freedom from the tyranny of singular existence." The philosophical debate was interrupted by an alarm from Webb's equipment. "The dimensional resonance is increasing. If it reaches critical mass, it will create a permanent gateway between all possible realities." Chen realized they were facing the same choice they had confronted with Thorn, but on a much larger scale. The Valen civilization had apparently achieved voluntary transformation centuries ago, and they had been working ever since to spread their gift to other species. "How many worlds?" she asked. 17 star systems currently participate in the network, the Valen replied. "Soon, all conscious beings will have the opportunity to join us in perfect unity." The battle that followed was unlike any they had previously experienced. The transformed Valen could manipulate reality itself, creating weapons from crystallized time and shields from folded space. But their millennia of existence in multiple dimensions had made them overconfident, and used to opponents who could adapt and improvise in real time. Zephi's ancient blade proved effective against their reality warping abilities, while Webb's harmonic cancellation devices could temporarily disrupt their dimensional manipulations. Rodriguez's tactical expertise allowed them to exploit the Valen's weaknesses, using the crystalline environment against them. But the real victory came when Chen realized that the Valen network, like Thorn's, required conscious will to maintain its dimensional resonance. Unlike Thorn, however, the Valen weren't being controlled by external entities, they were genuinely convinced that their path represented evolution rather than corruption. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said to the lead Valen as the battle raged around them. "You're not achieving transcendence, you're becoming tools for entities that want to remake reality according to their own design." "The entities are partners in evolution," the Valen replied. "They showed us the path beyond the limitations of singular existence." "They showed you how to become their agents," Chen countered. Every civilization that accepts their gift becomes another node in their network, another step toward the dissolution of everything that makes existence meaningful. For the first time, she saw doubt flicker in the Valen's multidimensional form. That is not possible. We achieved this transformation through our own research, our own understanding. Webb had been analyzing the energy patterns throughout their conversation, and his expression was grim. I'm detecting control signals embedded in the dimensional resonance. Subliminal influences that shape thought patterns and decision-making processes. The revelation hit the Valen like a physical blow. For centuries, they had believed themselves to be transcendent beings exploring the infinite possibilities of existence. Instead, they had been puppets, manipulated by the same entities that had corrupted Thorn and countless others throughout galactic history. The dimensional resonance began to fluctuate as the Valen's certainty wavered. Some of them fought to maintain the network, convinced that their transformation was still valid despite the evidence of external manipulation. Others began to question everything they had believed about their evolved state. In the end, it was the Valen themselves who chose to shut down the network. The realization that they had been deceived for millennia was devastating, but it also freed them to make a genuine choice about their future. Some chose to maintain their transformed state, accepting the risks in exchange for the expanded consciousness they had achieved. Others requested help in returning to something closer to their original form. But the most important discovery was the star charts they provided, showing the locations of similar networks throughout the galaxy. The entities had been playing a long game, seeding multiple civilizations with the technology and knowledge necessary to breach the dimensional barriers. How many? Chen asked as they prepared to return to the Defiant Star. Unknown, the Valen replied. But the pattern repeats throughout galactic history. Every few millennia, a species develops the technology necessary to detect interdimensional phenomena. The entities then guide them toward transformation, using their desperation or ambition to create new nodes in the network. Chen looked up at the stars visible through the planet's thin atmosphere, knowing that each point of light might harbor civilizations facing the same choice that humanity was confronting. The scope of the threat was larger than she had ever imagined, but so was the opportunity to make a difference. Then we have work to do, she said. Not just protecting our own civilization, but helping others make informed choices about their future. The return journey to Luna Base was subdued, each member of the team processing the implications of what they had discovered. The interdimensional entities weren't just threatening humanity, they were part of a cosmic pattern that had been repeating for millions of years, slowly converting the galaxy one civilization at a time. But knowledge was power, and now they understood the true scope of what they were fighting. The battle for humanity's future had become a war for the galaxy itself, and Chen was determined to see it through to the end. The stars held no answers, only questions. But perhaps that was enough. 2 years after the formation of the Paranormal Investigation and Response Division, Chen stood in the council chamber addressing representatives from across the galaxy. The time for secrecy had ended, the public revelation of the interdimensional threat had fundamentally changed the political landscape of the Empire, creating new alliances and new conflicts as different species and cultures grappled with the implications. The latest intelligence indicates 17 active networks operating throughout Imperial space, she reported, her voice carrying to delegates who represented billions of sentient beings. Each one follows the same pattern, technological civilizations that have developed the ability to detect interdimensional phenomena, then been guided toward transformation by entities from beyond the dimensional barriers. The holographic display showed the galaxy-wide scope of the threat, with each network marked by distinctive energy signatures. Some were ancient, like the Valen civilization, while others were more recent, species that had achieved dimensional breakthrough within the past few decades. Senator Vex, now serving as the Council's liaison to the division, spoke from his position at the central podium. Director Chen, what is your assessment of our current defensive capabilities? Chen considered her response carefully. The past 2 years had brought both victories and defeats, successes that had saved entire star systems and failures that had cost countless lives. We're holding the line, she said finally. But barely. Each network we shut down teaches the entities new ways to adapt and evolve their approach. They're learning from our tactics, developing countermeasures to our countermeasures. Dr. Webb, now serving as the division's chief scientific advisor, stepped forward to address the assembly. The fundamental problem is that we're fighting a defensive war against opponents who exist outside our normal understanding of time and causality. They can plan strategies that span millennia, while we're limited to thinking in terms of decades or centuries at most. A delegate from the Andorian hegemony raised a concern that had been voiced repeatedly over the past months. What guarantee do we have that your organization hasn't been compromised? If these entities can corrupt entire civilizations, how do we know they haven't already infiltrated your ranks? The question struck at the heart of the paranoia that had grown throughout the Empire as knowledge of the threat spread. Trust had become a precious commodity, and every unusual behavior or unexpected decision was scrutinized for signs of interdimensional influence. SciFi, who had been silent throughout most of the session, finally spoke. "There are no guarantees," he said bluntly. "Every person in this chamber could potentially be compromised, including myself. But that's exactly why we need multiple independent verification systems and constant vigilance." He activated a small device that had become standard equipment for all division personnel, a dimensional resonance detector that could identify the subtle reality distortions associated with interdimensional corruption. "This is our best defense against infiltration," he continued. "Not perfect, but effective against the current generation of entity influence. We scan ourselves daily, and we scan each other. It's not a pleasant way to live, but it's necessary." Captain Rodriguez, who had been coordinating the division's military operations, presented the tactical situation with characteristic directness. "We need to shift from reactive to proactive operations. Instead of waiting for networks to reveal themselves, we need to identify potential target civilizations and offer them protection before the entities make contact. That raises significant ethical questions," pointed out a delegate from the Terran Federation. "Are we prepared to interfere in the natural development of other species? What right do we have to deny them the choice of transformation?" The debate that followed touched on fundamental questions about free will, self-determination, and the nature of consciousness itself. Some argued that any civilization had the right to choose its own evolutionary path, even if that path led to dimensional transcendence. Others maintained that the entity's influence made genuine choice impossible. Chen listened to the arguments with growing frustration. Every minute spent in philosophical debate was time that could be used to save lives and prevent new networks from achieving critical mass. "The choice between transformation and preservation is meaningless if it's based on deception," she finally said, her voice cutting through the competing discussions. "The entities don't offer genuine transcendence, they offer slavery disguised as evolution." She activated the holographic display again, showing recordings from their encounters with various transformed civilizations. "Look at the evidence. Every species that accepts the entity's influence follows the same pattern: initial enthusiasm, followed by gradual loss of individual identity, culminating in complete subordination to the interdimensional collective. But some beings genuinely seem happier after transformation," another delegate pointed out. "The Valen we've interviewed express satisfaction with their expanded consciousness." Webb stepped forward again, his expression grim. "Satisfaction isn't the same as free will. The transformation process includes alterations to the brain's reward systems, making subjects biochemically incapable of regretting their choice. It's the ultimate form of addiction, not just psychological, but neurological." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. The idea that the entities could rewrite the basic structures of consciousness to ensure compliance was more disturbing than simple mind control. Senator Vex called for order as the chamber erupted in concerned voices. "The question before us," he said once quiet had been restored, "is what action we should take in response to this threat. Director Chen, what do you recommend?" Chen had been preparing for this moment for months, knowing that the Council would eventually demand a comprehensive strategy for dealing with the interdimensional crisis. The plan she was about to propose would commit the Empire to a course of action that could last for centuries. "We establish a galactic quarantine protocol," she said. "Any star system showing signs of dimensional experimentation is immediately isolated and offered assistance in shutting down the research. Those that refuse are quarantined until the threat can be neutralized. That's essentially a declaration of war against any civilization that chooses transformation, the Andorian delegate objected. No, Chen replied. It's a medical quarantine against a cosmic plague that destroys the capacity for genuine choice. We're not denying civilizations the right to evolve, we're protecting them from parasites that masquerade as partners. The debate continued for hours, with delegates arguing over the legal, ethical, and practical implications of the proposed protocol. But the evidence was overwhelming, and eventually, the vote was called. The Galactic Quarantine Protocol passed by a narrow margin, authorizing the division to take whatever steps were necessary to prevent the spread of interdimensional corruption. It was a momentous decision, one that would define the Empire's response to the crisis for generations to come. As the session concluded and delegates began filing out of the chamber, Chen felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They now had the authority they needed to act decisively, but they also had an enormous responsibility that would test the limits of their capabilities. Think it will work? Rodriguez asked as they made their way back to division headquarters. It has to, Chen replied. The alternative is watching the galaxy slowly transform into something unrecognizable. Over the following months, the division's operations expanded dramatically. New teams were formed and deployed throughout Imperial space, each one equipped with the latest detection equipment and countermeasures. The Galactic Quarantine Protocol was invoked 17 times in its first year, with mixed results. Some civilizations accepted assistance willingly, grateful for the warning about the true nature of interdimensional entities. Others resisted, viewing the Empire's intervention as cultural imperialism designed to suppress their technological development. 3 star systems had to be quarantined by force, their populations isolated until the dimensional corruption could be contained. But perhaps the most significant development was the formation of the Galactic Defense Alliance, a coalition of species and civilizations united in their opposition to the interdimensional threat. The alliance represented the first truly cooperative effort in galactic history, bringing together former enemies in the face of a common existential threat. It's remarkable, Webb observed during one of their regular briefings. The threat of dimensional corruption has accomplished what centuries of diplomacy couldn't, genuine cooperation between species that have been at odds for millennia. Chen nodded, but her attention was focused on the long-term implications. The entities are patient. They've been playing this game for millions of years, and they can afford to wait for us to make mistakes or become complacent. SciFi, who had been studying ancient texts from multiple civilizations, looked up from his research. There's something else to consider. What if this has all happened before? What if there have been previous galactic civilizations that faced the same threat? The possibility had occurred to Chen, but the implications were staggering. If the current galaxy was just the latest iteration in a cosmic cycle of rise and fall, then their struggle might be part of a pattern that stretched back to the beginning of time itself. Then we learn from their mistakes, she said finally. And we make sure that this time, the outcome is different. As she spoke, an alert chimed on the communication system. A new dimensional distortion had been detected in the Outer Rim territories, the largest energy signature they had ever recorded. All teams, prepare for immediate deployment, Chen announced. Whatever's happening out there, it's big enough to change everything. The stars wheeled overhead as ships throughout the galaxy began converging on the coordinates of the new threat. The war for reality itself was entering a new phase, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of the current galactic civilization, but possibly the nature of existence itself. In the depths of space, ancient entities stirred with anticipation. The final gambit was about to begin. 5 years after the revelation of the interdimensional threat, Chen stood on the observation deck of Deep Space Station Prometheus, watching the construction of humanity's most ambitious project since the founding of the Empire. The massive structure taking shape in the void before her was part research facility, part fortress, and part monument to the species that had chosen to stand against the darkness between the stars. The Eternal Watch, as it had come to be known, was humanity's answer to the patient malevolence of the interdimensional entities. Built at the gravitational balance point between 3 galaxies, it would serve as an early warning system and rapid response center for dimensional incursions anywhere in local space. The quantum resonance arrays are online, Webb reported from his position at the station's science station. We're detecting dimensional fluctuations from distances that were previously impossible to monitor. Rodriguez, now serving as the station's military commander, nodded approvingly at the tactical displays. 12 battle groups are on standby, ready to respond to any Level 5 incursions within 72 hours. It's the most comprehensive defense network in galactic history. SciFi, who had established a new order of warrior monks dedicated to combating supernatural threats, looked up from the ancient texts he had been studying. The patterns are becoming clearer. The entities operate on cycles that span millions of years, waiting for galactic civilizations to reach the point where dimensional research becomes feasible. Chen absorbed the information with the calm acceptance that had become her trademark over the years of battling impossible threats. The scale of what they were fighting had grown beyond anything she could have imagined when she first overheard Thorne's conversation with the entity. "Status report on the quarantine zones?" she asked. "Stable," Rodriguez replied. "The dimensional corruption in those systems has been contained, and rehabilitation programs are showing promising results. About 60% of the affected populations have successfully returned to baseline consciousness. It was better than they had initially hoped, but the cost had been enormous. Entire civilizations had been traumatized by the realization that their greatest achievements had been orchestrated by malevolent forces beyond their understanding. The psychological impact of such revelation had led to widespread social upheaval and, in some cases, complete cultural collapse." "What about the new detection protocols?" Chen asked. Webb activated a holographic display showing the galaxy-wide sensor network they had established over the past 5 years. "We're identifying potential target civilizations decades before they reach the critical threshold for dimensional research. Early intervention programs have prevented 17 separate infection events." The success rate was encouraging, but Chen knew that the entities were adapting to their tactics. Each prevented incursion taught their opponents new ways to approach potential target species, and the battle was becoming increasingly sophisticated. "There's something else," SciFi said, his expression troubled. "The ancient texts I've been translating suggest that this conflict isn't unique to our galaxy. The entities appear to be active throughout the universe, possibly throughout the multiverse itself." The implications were staggering. If the interdimensional threat existed on a cosmic scale, then their local victory, however significant, was just one battle in an infinite war. "Then we make sure our victory counts," Chen said firmly. "We document everything we've learned, preserve it for future civilizations, and make sure the knowledge survives even if we don't." The conversation was interrupted by an alert from the station's detection systems. A new dimensional anomaly had appeared in the Magellanic Clouds, small companion galaxies that orbited the Milky Way at a considerable distance. "Energy signature is consistent with a mature network," Webb reported, his voice tight with concern. "But the scale is unlike anything we've encountered. It appears to encompass multiple star systems simultaneously." Chen felt the familiar knot of tension forming in her stomach. After 5 years of fighting the interdimensional threat, she had learned to recognize the signs of a major escalation. "How long until it reaches critical mass?" she asked. "Unknown," Webb replied. "The patterns are different from anything in our database. It could be days, or it could be years." Rodriguez was already activating the emergency response protocols. "All available ships are being recalled from patrol duty. We can have a full battle group ready for deployment within 6 hours." "Do it," Chen ordered. "But maintain full quarantine protocols. We go and prepare for anything." As the station's personnel prepared for what might be their most challenging mission yet, Chen found herself thinking about the prophecy that had started it all. The entity had spoken of someone who would stand against the darkness, but perhaps it hadn't been referring to her specifically. Perhaps it had been describing the eternal struggle itself, the ongoing battle between order and chaos that defined existence at its most fundamental level. "Director," SciFi said quietly, approaching her position near the observation windows. "There's something I need to tell you. The texts I've been studying, they mention others. civilizations that faced the same threat and found ways to not just survive, but to strike back. Chen turned to face him, her interest clearly piqued. Strike back how? By turning the entity's own methods against them. Using dimensional manipulation technology to invade their realm rather than simply defending against their incursions. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. The possibility of taking the fight to the entity's home dimension offered hope for a permanent solution to the threat, but it also carried risks that were difficult to calculate. What would that require? She asked. Everything we've learned about dimensional physics, plus technologies that we're only beginning to understand. It would be the most dangerous mission in galactic history. Chen looked out at the construction crews working on the Eternal Watch, knowing that the massive station represented just the beginning of humanity's preparations for the cosmic war they were fighting. But perhaps it was time to start thinking beyond defense. Begin preliminary research, she said. Carefully, quietly, with full safeguards. If there's a way to end this threat permanently, we need to find it. As the years passed, the Eternal Watch became a symbol of hope for civilizations throughout the galaxy. The massive station served as proof that the interdimensional threat could be confronted and contained, that conscious beings could choose their own evolutionary path without manipulation by cosmic parasites. But Chen knew that their vigilance would need to be eternal. The entities existed outside normal concepts of time and space, and they would continue their patient efforts to corrupt and transform galactic civilization long after she and her team were gone. The war for reality itself would continue, fought by new generations of defenders who would face threats and challenges that were impossible to predict. But the foundation had been laid, the protocols established, and the knowledge preserved. In the depths of space, ancient entities stirred with frustrated malevolence, their plans delayed but not defeated. They had waited millions of years for this opportunity, and they could wait millions more. But now they knew they were not alone in the cosmic dark. Somewhere in the galaxy, beings of flesh and blood and stubborn determination stood watch against the darkness, ready to defend the light of consciousness against all who would extinguish it. The battle would continue, as it always had and always would. But for the first time in cosmic history, the darkness had learned to fear the light. And in her private moments, Chen allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough.